Hey there YouTube, welcome to Kerbal Space Program Live, but not your normal episode of Kerbal Space Program Live. Those of you that have been following us on YouTube may not realise that we do the videoing live over on Twitch, but I thought this time we'd do something slightly different. I thought we'd do a video just for the guys over on YouTube to show some of the experimentation that I do off screen. I don't do a lot of it for the live stream because I like it to be spontaneous, and obviously any mistakes that we make, I like you guys to see those mistakes. But every so often I get an idea for an important project, so I have a go at building the rocket off screen before we have a go. The rocket that I decided that we needed to try and build was a kind of refueling station. At the moment in the live stream we haven't unlocked the ability to build the clamping, the docking ports, which we would use to build a space station. But I thought they're going to be coming soon, so we best start planning for what we're going to use a space station for, because I'd like to get a space station up in the live stream. So this video that I've made here, I tried to put together a rocket using the technology that we basically have unlocked so far in the live stream, so only the very basic parts at this stage. But I thought I'd try and put it together something like one of the rockets that I would normally build. As you can see from the science parts that I'm putting on, you don't need those in sandbox mode. But obviously in the real game we would be putting the basic science parts on so that we can grab some science in space at the same time. So this rocket, the idea of this rocket was to have some kind of system where I could take fuel tanks up into orbit, leave them in orbit with some element of control, and at the same time have some system where another rocket could come up and refuel. Now, because we don't have the docking ports, we can't use the refueling part of it until we unlock those, but I've left space on the rockets that I've built here so that we can add those docking ports later. And then with those docking ports, obviously we can send a ship up, dock it, transfer the fuel from the station onto the rocket, and hopefully that would give us the basis of some kind of system that we can use to take fuel up to a station, leave it at the station, and then we can use that later for sending up smaller rockets, refueling them and sending them out onto a bigger mission. And they can take pretty much as much fuel as they like, because we can just top up whatever empty tanks they've got with them when they arrive at the station. So that's my plan. Now, as I was putting this rocket together, I tried to take into account everything that we might need, but I did make a few mistakes, as you will see as we go through the process. The first rocket that I built really didn't do very well at all. As you'll probably see here, I tried to make kind of an asymmetric rocket that would be able to take one fuel tank up to orbit. But unfortunately, as you'll see from the launch test, which is going to come up in a few moments, that didn't really go very well at all. In fact, it was a catastrophe. So let's just zip through to the launch and you'll see what I mean. This is us getting ready. Our SAS is on. Our throttle is set at 50%. We're off the ground, but very quickly you can see we are not going to space today. I quickly tried to hit all the staging to get the parachute out to save poor Jebediah, but it was clear that wasn't going to happen. So we had to revert back to the vehicle assembly building. So the asymmetric approach really doesn't work. However, in the 0.23 that's coming up soon, probably tomorrow, the tweakables might actually make an asymmetric rocket possible. Tweakables being the fact that you can adjust the relative power of different engines. For the moment though, what you can see that I've done here is I added another fuel tank to the other side to balance out the weight, and then we had another go at the launch. And the second launch was far more successful than the first launch. as you are about to see. So you can see we've got a nice straight launch, fairly average speed, probably not quite as fast as we need to go, but a good speed for the size of the rocket that we had, gaining height, nothing wobbling too much. Not the perfect rocket, as you'll see later on, but not too bad. Here you can see we've staged our solid boosters in the first stage of our liquid fuel. We're starting to gain a decent altitude, but I did make one mistake in that I made these next two stages the same size. I had 3 fuel tanks on either side and 3 fuel tanks in the middle, which meant technically we would stage all 3 at the same time, but I used slightly different rockets on each of the engines. Now, as we were reaching an apoapsis of 70,000 meters, I wanted to stage those 2 side tanks off, but they still had fuel in them. So I had to quickly move around the fuel to get it out of the side tank so that I could drop them off, leaving just the center tank so that we weren't carrying any unnecessary weight from the empty tanks up the top. So this is me quickly shuffling the fuel around, but unfortunately this kind of left us burning a little bit too late to circularize our orbit. So as you'll see in a minute, circularizing our orbit didn't quite go to plan, and we had to use a lot more fuel to circularize the orbit than we really should have done. And you'll see that in the next rocket that I build, I compensate for that by adding slightly more fuel to the center stage. So you can see our apoapsis is nice and high, but we're too close to the apoapsis when we start our burn, so our orbit doesn't build quick enough. Here we've just reached the point where we're staging off the last of our liquid fuel sections, leaving us with our small engine, and as you can see, we certainly haven't got a circular orbit at this point, which I'd really hoped we would have had. So I end up having to use the fuel in this stage to try and compensate for the fact that we started burning too late. You'll notice that while we're burning, I raise the angle of the burn quite significantly just so that we don't re-enter the atmosphere. It does kind of work. We do actually manage to get a circular orbit. Well, not a circular orbit, an elliptical orbit. We do manage to get an orbit out of this rocket, but it's really not the orbit that I was looking for. And you will notice that to shed some extra weight, I had to dump the 2 fuel tanks that I was actually hoping to take into space with us. So whilst we did manage to get the rocket into orbit, the overall mission turns out to be a failure. This is me dumping those fuel tanks, which I didn't do very well either. Had to then recorrect our trajectory. But those fuel tanks shed the weight that we needed to be able to stabilize the orbit of this rocket. So all in all, another failed launch. So back to the drawing board as we come up with a new idea for this rocket. Now, rather than scrap this rocket altogether, I do decide to finish circularizing out the orbit, albeit a bit strange. I decide that I'm going to leave this rocket in orbit. It does have some fuel on board after all, but I just decide that we're going to speed up time, warp this out the way, and then we'll build a new rocket to launch in its place. So this is me just zipping it around to the other side of the planet. I line it up quickly, give it a bit of a burn to bring the periapsis up out of the atmosphere. Wasn't really too worried about how accurate I was at this point. So here you go, 60,000, 70,000. So that's outside the atmosphere. I figured we'd make it a bit higher than that just to make sure that it was clear of anything else that we're launching. So there we go, at about 160,000 meters. We say goodbye to Jebediah Kerman in his failed refueler rocket. And we head back to the vehicle assembly building. So our previous attempt wasn't too bad. We managed to get it into orbit, but we didn't manage to take the fuel with us. So what I decided to do was to reduce the weight by reducing the amount of fuel that we took up with us, and also increasing the amount of fuel in the lower stage so that we had more of a chance of getting up into orbit with the fuel, and it got rid of the problem that we had with the staging where we had to transfer the fuel from one tank to another. So this is me just making a few tweaks. I also added a slightly more powerful engine to the upper stage so that we can get to a circular orbit slightly quicker. Named it number 2 and sent it out to the launch pad. So here we are back out on the launch pad, ready for another launch. Up to about 60% throttle this time, and we're up in the air. You'll see here our apoapsis is rising nicely. We're just heading up to 70,000 meters for our apoapsis, stopping at about 76,000 meters there. And I figured this time we would put a maneuver in place so that we knew roughly how long we needed to burn. Looking at the fuel we had left in those 3 outer tanks, or 6 outer tanks, it seemed fairly likely that we were going to get an orbit this time, so I set myself up and we were getting ready for a burn. Now we did have a slight mishap in this next procedure. The burn went very well. We managed to get a decent orbit, but as you'll see in a moment, releasing the tanks from the staging didn't quite go as planned. Here we are burning, using up the last fuel on those 6 outer tanks, leaving some fuel left in the center tank. For our last stage of the circularization of the orbit. And as we come to use up the last bits of the fuel in the outer tanks, we stage them away, and bang! We get a slight collision. Fortunately, it looks like no damage was done to the main rocket. The damage was obviously done to the nose cone, or the top fuel tank of the tanks that we were letting go. So we were still able to continue, and I decided to get rid of the maneuver because the timing was a bit out of sync now. So I kind of played it by ear for a bit, increased our angle slightly because obviously the power had changed from dropping all the engines. But on our last stage, you can see that we have plenty of fuel. It's burning nicely, and we are on a nice trajectory to be able to get a proper orbit out of this. Here we go. We see the apoapsis and the periapsis trade places, and that is our sign that we are successful. So there we go. This is what we ended up with in orbit around Kerbal on our, let's say, 3rd attempt. We actually ended up with 3 full fuel tanks and 1 more than half full large fuel tank. So this is a lot of fuel to have, but unfortunately we didn't take any docking clamps with us because we haven't yet unlocked those in the career mode. But add a couple of docking clamps to the bottom of those fuel tanks there and you've got yourself a nice little refueling station with 3.5 full fuel tanks. And this is what it all looked like. So I hope you've enjoyed this little video of a behind the scenes. We will be back to our normal transmissions too. See you then.